The fog came first. It rolled down from the Matra Hills in the early hours of September 9th, 1552, spreading across the valley of the Eger River like a grey wool blanket pulled over a wound. The town of Eger slept beneath it, or tried to. In the castle on the hill, nobody slept at all. Torches burned along the battlements. Men stood at their posts and stared south into the mist, listening for something they could not yet see, but could already feel in the soles of their feet. A trembling in the earth, faint but unmistakable, like the heartbeat of a creature too large to comprehend. By the time the sun burned the fog away, they could see it. The Ottoman army stretched across the valley floor in every direction that mattered. It came not as a column, but as a world. A moving civilization of war, uncoiling from the southern passes like a jeweled serpent of iron and silk and fire, its scales glinting in the September morning. There were tents by the thousands, artillery trains pulled by hundreds of oxen, supply caravans of 2,000 camels carrying enough food and powder and ambition to swallow kingdoms whole. Janissary infantry in white felt caps marched in formations so precise they looked carved from a single block of stone. Sipahi cavalry wheeled across the open ground in sweeping arcs, their horses' breath misting in the cool air. And above it all, the banners, red and green and gold, the crescent moon catching the light, rippling like the surface of an ocean that had decided this year to flow north. István Dobó stood on the wall of Eger Castle and looked down at all of it. He did not flinch. He did not speak. He simply counted, the way a man counts coins when he already knows he does not have enough. Inside the walls behind him stood approximately 2,100 people, not 2,100 soldiers, people. Professional fighting men, yes, but also farmers who had never held a sword before August. Blacksmiths, craftsmen, priests, a handful of women who had refused to leave. And 6 German gunners hired from abroad because Dobó had not been able to find enough Hungarians who knew how to aim a cannon properly. 2,100 human beings, wrapped in iron and prayer, standing on a hilltop in northern Hungary. Below them, 35,000 to 40,000 of the finest warriors on earth. The ratio was not a military problem, it was a mathematical joke. But this is not the story of a joke. This is the story of what happens when a small group of people decide, with absolute clarity and zero illusion, that they will not move. Not because they believe they can win, not because they have been promised relief or rescue or divine intervention, but because the alternative, stepping aside, opening the gate, watching the serpent continue north, is something they have decided in the marrow of their bones they cannot allow. The stakes climbed in layers, the way floodwater climbs. On the surface, this was a single castle. 40 acres of stone on a hill in northern Hungary. Strategically important, but not, on its face, the kind of place empires are made or broken. Dig one layer deeper and Eger becomes a key. The key to Upper Hungary, to the silver mines of Kassa that funded the entire Habsburg resistance, to the only viable road north that kept the remnant of free Hungary alive. Dig deeper still, and the picture opens into something vast and cold. Because if Eger fell, the Ottoman Empire gained a second logistical corridor toward Vienna. And Vienna had already been besieged once, in 1529. The next time it fell, it would not rise again. And behind Vienna, the rest of Europe. The cathedral cities and the trade routes and the printing presses and everything that had been built, slowly, painfully, over 1,000 years. All of that, every last thread of it, ran through this one hilltop in northern Hungary. And it was defended by 2,100 people who had nowhere else to go. Dobu turned from the wall. He walked back toward the inner courtyard without looking at the numbers again. He already knew them. He had known them for weeks. The knowing had not changed anything. It would not change anything now. He had a castle to defend. To understand why Eger mattered, you have to understand what Hungary had already lost. 26 years before the fog rolled in over the Eger Valley, the Kingdom of Hungary had been one of the great powers of Central Europe. A nation of 4 million people, a wealthy crown, a professional army, and 8 centuries of history stamped into every stone and field from the Carpathians to the Adriatic. It was not a perfect kingdom. Its nobles squabbled, its kings overreached, its peasants suffered in the way peasants had always suffered everywhere. But it was a kingdom. It had borders and laws and a capital city and a future. Then came August 29th, 1526. The Battle of Mohacs lasted approximately 2 hours. In those 2 hours, the Ottoman army of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, commanding perhaps 60 to 70,000 men, backed by artillery that had no equal in Europe, destroyed the Hungarian royal army so completely, so efficiently, so finally, that the event barely registers as a battle in the historical record. It was more like an erasure. The Hungarian cavalry charged in the traditional way and was met by Ottoman cannon fire that tore through the formations like a scythe through wheat. The King of Hungary, Louis II, 20 years old, in his first and only battle, fled the field and drowned in a swamp while his horse panicked in the mud. He left behind no heir, no clear succession, and no army. In 2 hours, 8 centuries of Hungarian statehood cracked at the foundation. What followed was not a quick collapse, but something worse. A slow fracturing that stretched across a generation. Hungary split into 3 pieces, like a log under an axe. The western and northern sliver became Royal Hungary, ruled by the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand I from Vienna, always undermanned and underfinanced, always looking nervously eastward. The central heartland, including Buda, the capital, fell to Ottoman occupation in 1541, becoming the seat of a pasha and the western edge of the empire. The east became Transylvania, nominally independent, but practically a vassal state of the Sultan, a buffer zone held together by careful diplomacy and constant fear. 15 million square kilometers of medieval European civilization, reduced to a chess game between 2 empires that barely saw Hungary as a player. The people who remained in Royal Hungary, the fragment that still answered to Vienna, that still called itself the Kingdom of Hungary, even as that name shrank with each passing year, lived with a particular kind of grief. It was not the grief of sudden loss, but of slow erosion. The grief of watching your world become smaller every decade, every year, every season. Buda, once your capital, now had minarets on its skyline. The towns you grew up in were Ottoman garrison posts. The roads your grandfather travelled now led to frontier checkpoints. And the Ottomans were not done. The year 1552 was not a surprise. It had been coming for years, visible in the way storms are visible on an open plain. You cannot see the lightning yet, but you can feel the pressure dropping, smell the ozone, watch the birds go silent. Sultan Suleiman had sent his armies north multiple times since Mohacs, probing, testing, consolidating. The siege of Guns in 1532 had been stopped by a single Croatian captain named Nikola Jurisic and 800 men, a miracle that bought Vienna 25 days and nothing more. The fall of Buda in 1541 had swallowed the capital. And now, in 1552, the Sultan decided that the patchwork resistance of Royal Hungary needed to be ended permanently. The instrument of that decision was Kara Ahmed Pasha, the second vizier of the Ottoman Empire. Ahmed was not a man given to self-doubt. He had served the empire at the highest levels for decades, had fought campaigns across 3 continents, had watched Christian fortresses crumble before Ottoman cannon fire the way old men watch sunsets, with satisfaction but without surprise. He was the kind of commander who did not walk into a room. He entered it, the way weather enters a room, changing the pressure of everything present. His orders arrived from Constantinople not as suggestions, but as facts about the future. This will fall, that will be captured, here is the schedule. In the spring of 1552, those facts read like a campaign itinerary through a landscape that had already been conquered in his mind. He was not entirely wrong about the landscape. The campaign of 1552 opened with a momentum that justified his confidence. Temeshvar fell. Szolnok fell, its garrison of mercenary soldiers collapsing so quickly that the news reached the Hungarian court before the battle was fully over, carried by men who had stopped fighting before the first assault was even repelled. Veszprém fell. Dregeli fell after a heroic but brief resistance by a captain named György Sondi, who died with his boots on and his sword in his hand and 2 pages killed beside him, but whose garrison had numbered less than 150 men. 25 Hungarian strongholds fell in the summer of 1552, one after another, like dominoes tipped by a steady and patient hand. By the time Ahmed Pasha united his army with the forces of Ali Pasha, the governor of Buda, the pattern was so well established that the next item on the list, a modest castle town in northern Hungary called Eger, barely registered as a challenge worth discussing. Ali Pasha was a different kind of man than Ahmed, and the difference mattered enormously, though neither of them understood yet how much it would cost them. Where Ahmed was imperial and broad, Ali was precise and hungry. He had spent years governing Buda, watching the frontier from close range, developing an artilleryman's obsession with angles and trajectories, and the specific weak points in specific walls. He was the kind of man who won arguments by being right more often than was comfortable for the people around him. Ahmed outranked him. Ahmed resented him already, and the two of them were now expected to cooperate on what Ahmed believed would be a routine conclusion to a brilliant campaign. The road to Eger was paved with 38 consecutive Ottoman victories. North of Eger, barely a day's march away, lay Kassa, the city that anchored the mining region of Upper Hungary, producing silver and gold coinage that funded every soldier, every wall, every scrap of resistance that Habsburg Hungary could still muster. Without Kassa's mines, there was no money. Without money, there were no soldiers. Without soldiers, the fragments of Royal Hungary would not last a winter. And without Royal Hungary as a buffer, without that thin, aching, exhausted line of stone and flesh, there was nothing between the Ottoman Empire and the heart of Europe but open road and wishful thinking. The castle that stood between all of that and the Ottoman army was held by a man named István Dobó. Dobó had arrived at Eger not as a hero, but as an administrator, appointed captain of the fortress in 1548 by Ferdinand I, tasked with organizing its defenses and extracting taxes from the surrounding region with the thoroughness that had already earned him a reputation for ruthlessness in financial matters. He was not universally loved. He was demanding, inflexible on matters of discipline, and possessed of the particular stubbornness that either saves organizations or destroys them, depending entirely on the circumstances. The circumstances, as it turned out, called for exactly his kind of stubbornness. Weeks before the Ottoman army appeared on the southern horizon, Dobó had written to Vienna requesting reinforcements, supplies, additional artillery, and money. The letters came back with polite regrets. The treasury was strained. The army was committed elsewhere. Perhaps next spring. Perhaps something could be arranged. Perhaps Dobó should do what he could with what he had. He read the last letter. set it down on the table, and looked at it for a long moment. Then he called a meeting of every able-bodied person inside the walls of Eger. He stood before them in the inner courtyard. Soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, women, children old enough to carry stones. And he said words that were recorded and embroidered over centuries, but whose essential truth has never been doubted. That the gate was still open. That anyone who feared for their flesh more than their country was free to leave now, before the choice was made for them. That he needed warriors, not bodies. That he would rather stand with 12 lions than 1,000 rabbits. He paused. Nobody walked toward the gate. He nodded once. Then he started giving orders. What Dobor understood, what set him apart from the other Hungarian commanders who had folded that summer, was not courage exactly, though he had courage. It was clarity. He had no illusions about relief arriving. He had no belief in miracles. He had no confidence that God was watching Hungary with particular attention that autumn. What he had was a cold, precise understanding of what had to be done, and a willingness to do it without flinching, and without asking the universe for its permission. He looked at Eger Castle, and he did not see a fortress that might hold. He saw a problem to be solved, one wall at a time, one day at a time, one Ottoman assault at a time. He got to work. The castle of Eger sat on the eastern edge of town, on a hillside that rose steeply enough to give its defenders a permanent angle of advantage over anything approaching from below. It was not a beautiful fortress, not the kind of place that inspired songs about soaring towers and gleaming battlements. It was functional, dense, pragmatic, built in the way that things get built when the people building them are more worried about surviving the next attack than impressing posterity. The walls were thick where they needed to be thick, and reinforced where they had been breached before, and the whole structure had a stubborn, low-to-the-ground solidity that came from being constructed on the ruins of something even older. Those ruins mattered more than anyone fully appreciated until the siege began. Beneath the current castle lay the foundations of an earlier stone fort, and beneath that the remains of an ancient earthen encampment that historians would later attribute, with varying degrees of certainty, to the Hunnic peoples who had swept through this region 12 centuries before. Whatever its origin, that ancient foundation had one remarkable property. It was extraordinarily hard to mine. Ottoman siege tactics relied heavily on tunneling, digging beneath walls, packing the tunnel with gunpowder, and collapsing the foundation from below. It was a technique that had broken open some of the most heavily fortified positions in Europe. At Eger, the miners drove their tunnels into earth that had been compacting for 1,000 years, hit the old stone and ancient packed soil, and made almost no progress at all. The mountain itself was part of the defence. The castle's layout consisted of an inner and outer fortress, separated by an internal wall with a gate at its centre. 6 bastions jutted from the outer walls at intervals designed to allow crossfire: the Earth Bastion and Prison Bastion on the northwest, Sandor Bastion on the north wall, Boliki Bastion on the northeast corner, Bebek Bastion on the eastern corner of the outer fortress, and the Dobo Bastion on the western wall. The Varkoch Gate opened in the south wall of the inner fortress, and the Church Bastion divided the 2 sections of the compound. Each bastion created its own field of fire, its own killing ground, its own interlocking zone of coverage that made approaching any section of wall a guaranteed exposure to fire from at least 2 directions. It was a good design. But it had weaknesses, and Dobor knew exactly where they were. The eastern outer wall, particularly the section near Bebek Bastion, was lower than ideal and faced the terrain most accessible to approaching attackers. The church bastion, dividing the compound's two halves, would become a critical choke point if the outer fortress was ever breached. The water supply was adequate but not abundant, meaning a prolonged siege in dry autumn weather could create pressure on the garrison. And the hilltop position that gave such excellent fields of fire also meant that any breach in the wall created an immediate plunging approach. If attackers got into the compound, the defenders would be fighting downhill, losing the angle advantage that was one of their primary assets. Dobor spent the weeks before the siege addressing every one of these weaknesses with the methodical focus of a man who understood that preparation, not inspiration, would determine whether the castle survived September. The artillery was repositioned to concentrate the heaviest guns on the approaches to the eastern wall. Ammunition was inventoried, catalogued, and rationed with a strictness that annoyed the gunners and saved their lives. Stone reserves were accumulated on every bastion, not just cannonballs, but loose rock, rubble, anything that could be dropped from height onto men climbing ladders. Cauldrons were mounted at intervals along the wall walk, ready to be filled with water or oil, or the pitch-black bitumen that, when heated to the right temperature, turned human skin into something that could not be described politely. Food stores were assessed and found adequate for weeks, not months. A calculation that added its own quiet pressure to everything else. The people who would defend the castle numbered, when the final count was made, approximately 2,100 to 2,300 souls. Of those, roughly 1,530 were capable of active combat duty. The breakdown was not what any military planner would have designed. There were professional soldiers, Hungarian cavalry and infantry who had been stationed at Eger before the crisis arrived. Men who knew their weapons and their positions and had trained together long enough to function as units rather than individuals. There were 6 German master gunners, hired at significant expense because Dobor had determined that the castle's artillery, properly handled, was potentially its most powerful asset. And proper handling required men who had spent their careers learning how powder behaves in different humidity, how barrel angles translate to trajectory, how to read the wind that determines whether a cannonball lands on a wall or sails harmlessly past it. And then there were the others. Farmers from the surrounding villages who had come inside the walls when the Ottoman army began moving north and had not gone back out when Dobor asked for volunteers. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons, whose skills turned out to be far more militarily useful than they might have imagined. Because a fortress under siege is also a construction project in continuous crisis, requiring constant repair of damage that arrives faster than peacetime building ever demanded. Priests who had set aside their robes for something heavier, and women, not a symbolic handful, but an organized contingent who understood that the walls of Eger were the walls of their homes, their families, their children's futures, and who were prepared to defend those walls with exactly the ferocity that the understanding implied. Among the 1,530 fighters, one young officer commanded a detachment of 250 Hungarian infantry. His name was Gergely Bornemisza, and his 250 men were competent and disciplined, and would have been entirely unremarkable in the broader sweep of a siege, except for what Bornemisza had been doing in the weeks before the Ottoman army arrived. He had been building things in the storage rooms below the castle, not weapons exactly, or not weapons that would have been recognized as such by any standard military inventory of the period. He had been taking cauldrons and wooden barrels and millstone wheels, the heavy circular stones used to grind grain, each weighing hundreds of pounds, and packing them with gunpowder mixed with oil and sulfur and small fragments of flint. The principle was straightforward in concept and extraordinarily dangerous in execution. He wanted to create devices that did not simply explode, but that scattered burning material over a wide area, that turned the space around them into zones of fire rather than zones of concussive force. Standard grenades of the period killed people with pressure and fragmentation. Bornemisza's devices killed people with fire that stuck to clothing and skin, that could not be easily extinguished, that transformed the immediate environment from a place where soldiers could function into a place where soldiers were burning alive and trying to escape from themselves. The millstone wheels were the most audacious element. The castle sat on a hill. The Ottoman forces would attack from below. A millstone wheel packed with gunpowder and incendiary material, given an initial push down a steep slope, would accelerate to considerable velocity before it hit anything. And when it hit, it would not merely damage what it struck, but scatter burning material across a broad arc, turning the approach slope into something that made every following attacker watch the ground ahead with terror, instead of watching the walls above. Bornemisza had the scorch marks on his hands and eyebrows to prove he had tested these devices himself. His name, the records note with dry Hungarian irony, meant "does not drink wine." He was, apparently, the kind of man who compensated for sobriety with an enthusiasm for explosives. The Ottoman force that arrived below Eger on September 9th was not one army, but two, welded together by imperial command and strained already by the personalities of the men who led them. Kara Ahmed Pasha commanded the larger contingent, the Rumelian army and an Anatolian division that had marched from the eastern provinces, veterans of multiple campaigns, supported by artillery that represented the state-of-the-art in siege warfare. His portion of the combined force included the heaviest guns, the Zarbuzan, enormous siege cannon capable of throwing stone balls carved from marble over great distances, designed specifically to reduce medieval walls to rubble over a period of sustained bombardment. Ahmed had 16 of these engines of architectural destruction, plus 150 additional pieces of medium and smaller artillery, and the 2,000 camels that served as the supply chain for an operation of this scale, moving wood, water, food, powder, and the 10,000 other things that a siege army required every single day just to remain functional. Ali Pasha of Buda brought fewer men, but arguably greater tactical intelligence. He had spent years watching the Hungarian frontier, developing an artilleryman's precision that translated into results. 4 large guns positioned by Ali had, in previous engagements that summer, produced more wall damage more efficiently than many commanders achieved with twice the artillery. Ali understood siege geometry. He understood the relationship between battery placement, angle of fire, and the structural vulnerabilities of specific wall sections. He was, in short, the better commander for a siege operation. Ahmed outranked him and had more guns, and the combination of those two facts would become one of the most consequential command failures in Ottoman military history. Together, their combined force numbered between 35,000 and 40,000 men. The real number, stripped of the patriotic Hungarian accounts that would later multiply it to 150,000 or even 200,000, in order to make the defence seem more miraculous than it already was. The actual ratio of attackers to defenders was somewhere between 17 and 19 to 1. This was still, by any reasonable military calculation, not a siege, but an announcement. 35,000 experienced Ottoman soldiers, supported by the finest siege artillery in the world, against 2,000 people on a hill. The announcement, everyone assumed, would be brief. On the night before the first Ottoman trumpets sounded in the valley below, the castle of Eger settled into the particular silence that precedes violence. A silence that has a different texture than ordinary quiet, thicker, more attentive, as if the air itself is listening for something. Fires burned low in the courtyard. Men sharpened blades they had sharpened already 3 times that week, because sharpening was something to do with hands that needed to be occupied. Prayers were said in the castle chapel, the Latin words worn smooth by repetition into something that sounded less like petition and more like anchor. In one of the storage rooms, a woman heated a pot over a small fire, not for cooking, but for the habit of it, the normality of warm food at the end of a day. She was the wife of one of the Hungarian infantry soldiers, one of the women who had not left when the Ottoman banners first appeared on the southern horizon. She was not young, but she was not old, and she had the kind of face that circumstances had made precise. Every feature economical, focused, stripped of anything unnecessary. She had made her decision weeks ago. She would stay. She would fight. She would do what needed to be done when the time came. And the time would come. And she would be ready. The pot on the fire was cauldron-sized. It could heat a great deal of water. She had noted its location relative to the eastern wall. Dobo walked the perimeter alone in the last hour before midnight, moving from post to post with a torch and a word for each sentry. Not speeches, not inspiration. Specific, practical acknowledgements. The kind of thing a commander communicates when he trusts the people he is talking to. A nod here, a brief instruction there. At the Bebek bastion, overlooking the approach most likely to be targeted first, he stood for a long moment, looking south, at the 1,000 lights of the Ottoman camp below, spread across the valley like a city that had decided to move north overnight. He thought about the letter from Vienna that he had not answered. He turned back to the wall. The fog would come again in the morning. So would everything else. Phase 1. The Demand and the Drums. The morning of September 9th, 1552, arrived without drama. That was the strange thing. Given what was below the hill, given the scale, the numbers, the firepower assembled in the valley, you might have expected the day to announce itself with thunder. Instead, it came in ordinary. Cool air, carrying the smell of dew and horses. Birdsong from the trees on the slopes below the castle walls. The soft rattle of equipment as the garrison took their morning positions. The kind of morning that, in any other autumn, would have made men glad to be alive. Then the drums began. Not artillery, not the crash of cannon or the screaming of attack. Drums. Ottoman kettle drums. The kurs. Enormous instruments mounted on camelback that produced a sound less like percussion and more like the pulse of something geological. A rhythm that travelled through the soles of the feet and up through the legs and into the chest, where it sat next to the heartbeat and reminded it who was in charge. The sound reached the castle walls before any human eye could distinguish individual figures in the Ottoman formations below, and for a full minute it was only that. The drums and the growing light, and the smell of 40,000 men arranging themselves for business. Then the Ottoman army came fully visible. The formations were precise in the way that only highly trained armies achieve. Not the mechanical precision of parade grounds, but the practiced, purposeful precision of people who have done this specific thing many times and know exactly where they belong and why. The Janissary infantry, the elite corps of the Ottoman military, recruited as children, trained for decades, paid better than any European infantry of the period, moved into position with the unhurried confidence of craftsmen. The Sipahi cavalry ranged across the open ground to the south and east, cutting off any possibility of escape or resupply in those directions. Artillery crews began the slow, laborious process of positioning the great Zarbuzan cannon, each gun requiring teams of men and oxen to maneuver across terrain that became less cooperative the closer it got to the hillside. An Ottoman messenger rode to within shouting distance of the gate. He carried the standard demand: surrender the castle, submit to the mercy of the Sultan, and be spared. Resistance was futile. The castle would fall. The calculus of survival was simple. All that was required was the opening of the gate. The message reached Dobo. He read it. He folded it. He placed it in the fire. The messenger rode back to the Ottoman lines with nothing. Ahmed Pasha gave the defenders 7 days to reconsider. It was a standard courtesy of siege warfare, a formal interval that also served the practical purpose of allowing the artillery to be properly positioned and aimed without the distraction of an active battle. For 7 days, the valley below the castle was a hive of controlled activity. Guns moved, trenches dug, siege platforms constructed from the timber that 2,000 Ottoman camels had carried from the forests to the south. The defenders watched from the walls and did their own work, checking positions, rehearsing response protocols, ensuring that every defender knew exactly where they were supposed to be when the first assault came, and exactly what they were supposed to do when they got there. The silence of those 7 days was its own kind of assault. It gave the imagination time to work. It let the numbers sink in. It allowed the full weight of what was coming to press down on 2,000 people who had nowhere to run and had already decided they wouldn't run anyway. Several men, accounts suggest, needed to be talked away from the wall on the 3rd and 4th nights. Not deserters exactly, but men whose nerve was being gradually dissolved by the arithmetic below them. Dobor walked those nights. He talked to those men. The accounts do not record what he said, but the effect was consistent. They stayed. On September 16th, Ahmed Pasha accepted that no answer was coming. The bombardment began. 7 great Zarbuzan were placed at positions chosen for maximum effect on the eastern outer wall, the section covering Bebek Bastion and the gate tower at the southeastern corner of the outer fortress. The opening salvos were almost exploratory, the gunners calibrating distance and elevation, reading the way the cannonballs interacted with the specific stone of Eger's walls. By the end of the first day, the calibration was complete. By the end of the second day, the stone face of the eastern outer wall had begun to show the first fractures. Not breaches yet, but the hairline patterns that precede them, the way ice shows cracks before it breaks. Inside the walls, the sound was a physical experience. Each Zarbuzan impact transmitted through the stone and into the feet, the legs, the spine. A shudder that was not quite pain, but was not anything else either. Dust rained from the mortar between the stones. The air tasted of pulverized rock and something sharper, metallic, the residue of black powder combusting at high pressure. Men who had been calm on the 7th day of silence were surprised to discover that they preferred the silence. At least silence didn't shake the ground beneath them. At least silence didn't remind them, every 90 seconds, that somewhere beyond the wall, a human being was deliberately trying to erase the structure between them and 40,000 soldiers. But Dobor had prepared for this. The German gunners positioned their battery with the careful precision that justified their salary, targeting not the mass of the Ottoman formations, too distant, too spread, not cost-effective, but the artillery positions themselves. The counter-battery fire was not always successful, but it was consistent enough to force the Ottoman crews to work with an awareness that they were being watched and targeted, which is not the same as being under fire, but is not entirely unlike it either. Every few hours, an Ottoman gun position took a hit. Every few hours, a crew was reminded that the castle they were trying to reduce was not entirely passive about the process. The Hungarians also discovered, in those first days of bombardment, one of the siege's peculiar quirks. The Ottoman cannonballs were not iron, but marble, carved from stone at considerable expense and labour, beautiful in an abstract way, architectural artifacts of destruction. When they struck the walls and embedded themselves or lodged in crevices, they stayed put, filling gaps in the masonry with a material nearly as hard as the stone itself. The castle was being hit by approximately 300 cannonballs a day. By the time the siege ended, nearly 12,000 cannonballs would have landed within the walls or struck them. Some of those 12,000 would kill people. Many would fill cracks. A few would, paradoxically, strengthen sections of the wall they hit. The defenders swept the impacts into repair material where they could. Nothing was wasted. The castle was teaching them its own language of survival. Phase 2. The Feast of St. Michael. By September 28th, after 12 days of continuous bombardment, the eastern outer wall had been reduced to a state that could no longer be honestly described as intact. The section between Bebek Bastion and the old gate tower had been struck hundreds of times, chipped and cracked and beaten down, until sections of the facing had collapsed entirely, and what remained was a broken, irregular line of rubble that offered uncertain footing and uncertain cover. It was not yet a breach, not an opening that an attacker could simply walk through, but it was close. Ali Pasha's 4-gun battery had done particular damage, with a precision that vindicated every argument he had made about battery placement, and Ahmed Pasha, to his credit, had allowed it. September 29th was the Feast of St. Michael, patron of warriors, guardian of soldiers facing impossible odds, the angel whose name armies had invoked across 1,000 years of European warfare when the numbers were wrong and the faith had to compensate for the arithmetic. The Ottoman drums changed rhythm. The change was perceptible even from the castle walls, a shift from the steady pulse of occupation to something faster, more deliberate, the rhythm of preparation rather than patience. Then came the horns. Then came the sound that siege defenders had dreaded since the walls of Jericho, the organized movement of tens of thousands of men, the collective thud and rustle and clank of an army rising from its positions and beginning to move forward with purpose. Dobor's voice carried across every section of the wall simultaneously, or it seemed to in the accounts, which may have conflated several orders into one. The cannon crews loaded. The infantry took their positions at the wall walk. The stone reserves were checked, the cauldrons positioned. The men in the inner fortress braced for the possibility that the outer wall might not hold. The first Ottoman wave hit the eastern outer wall section like a wave hitting a cliff. The same energy, the same noise, the same spray of water at the point of impact, except that the spray here was human beings, and the noise was the sound of approximately 8,000 Janissary infantry closing the distance between themselves and a wall they had been told was now weak enough to scale. They were not entirely wrong about the weakness. The gate tower at the southeastern corner, the Okaputoroni, fell first. It had been battered for days, and its footing was compromised, and a concentrated Ottoman assault with scaling ladders and covering fire from Janissary archers took it in approximately 20 minutes of close fighting that cost both sides heavily. Ottoman soldiers poured onto the platform. For a moment, a terrible, clarifying moment, the outer fortress had been breached at a specific point, and the men at that point were planting a crescent flag on something that had been Hungarian that morning. Dobor saw it from the church bastion. He did not hesitate. He did not consult. He turned to the heaviest guns in the castle, the largest artillery pieces positioned on the inner wall, and he gave an order that would have struck many commanders as lunatic. Aim at the gate tower. The tower that now held Ottoman soldiers. The tower that was technically still part of the castle's fabric. The tower that, if it stood, would give the Ottomans a foothold inside the outer wall, from which an entire section of the fortress could unravel. The guns fired. The gate tower came apart. The explosion, because it was essentially an explosion, the concentrated impact of heavy cannon fire on already weakened masonry, sent stone in every direction without regard for uniform, creed, or the instructions of anyone present. Ottoman soldiers died. Hungarian soldiers who were too close died. The structure ceased to exist as a coherent feature of the wall line, replaced by a pile of rubble that was simultaneously a wound in the castle and a barrier that made the breach it had been harder to exploit. In the chaos that followed, Bornemisa moved. He had been waiting for exactly this moment, not the fall of the tower specifically, but the moment when the Ottoman forward elements were concentrated in a specific location, pressed together by the geometry of the assault, unable to disperse. He had positioned himself and a crew of trusted men below the Bebek bastion, with one of his millstone wheels packed with powder and incendiary material. And when the gate tower collapsed and the Ottoman assault briefly compressed into the rubble zone, he set the wheel in motion down the slope. What happened next entered Hungarian military legend and never entirely left it. The wheel accelerated down the hillside, covering perhaps 40 meters before striking the edge of the Ottoman formation. The gunpowder ignited on impact, not cleanly, not in a single detonation, but in a series of cascading bursts that scattered burning material in a wide arc, the sulfur and oil mixture producing flames that adhered to whatever they touched and could not be reliably extinguished by men who were already trying to process the cognitive shock of a burning millstone arriving at high velocity from above. The effect was not merely physical, but psychological. The formation that had been pressing forward fractured, its rear elements colliding with the front as the front tried to reverse. The whole assault losing the coherent forward momentum that made it lethal. The first great assault of the Siege of Eger broke apart in the late afternoon of September 29th. Repelled not by weight of numbers, the defenders had no weight of numbers, but by a combination of concentrated artillery, tactical ruthlessness, and the calculated chaos that Bornemisa had been manufacturing in the storage rooms for weeks. The eastern outer wall still stood. The gate tower did not. But the gate tower had served its purpose. So had the millstone wheel. By nightfall, the Ottomans had retreated to their siege lines. The defenders counted their dead. They patched the wall with rubble. They reloaded everything that needed reloading. Nobody slept, but nobody ran. Phase 3. The night the sky went white. The first days of October brought a new kind of tension. The tension of waiting for the next blow, while knowing that the castle had absorbed the first one and was still, improbably, functional. The bombardment continued without pause. Ottoman miners worked their tunnels into the hillside with the methodical persistence of their trade, and the defenders worked equally methodical counter-tunnels to intercept them, filling the underground with a slow, dark chess game played with shovels in absolute blackness. Neither side made decisive progress underground. The ancient foundations held. Above ground, the damage accumulated. Sections of wall that had been solid on September 9th were now irregular and patched, held together with rubble and improvisation, and the prayer that the next cannonball would hit somewhere less critical than the last one. The defenders' casualty count had been climbing steadily since the first assault, not dramatically, not in the catastrophic waves of a battle lost, but in the quiet, daily arithmetic of a siege. One man here from a cannonball fragment, two there from a wall section giving way unexpectedly, a gunner whose gun exploded at the breach because the metal had been weakened by repeated firing. The garrison that had numbered 1,530 fighters in September was smaller now. Exactly how much smaller depended on the day. And then came the night of October 4th. By what cause no one has ever determined with certainty. Loose powder, an errant spark, a moment of carelessness in the deepest hours of the night when attention slackens. The storage tower in the outer fortress, which contained the garrison's reserve supply of black gunpowder, ceased to exist. 24 metric tons of black powder detonated simultaneously. The sound reached villages 10 kilometers away. People who were asleep woke and did not know at first whether it was thunder or earthquake or the beginning of something that had no precedent in their experience. Inside the castle, the effect was beyond description in the literal sense. The accounts that survive describe it in terms of light and force and the absence of certain things that had been present before, but the actual experience of being within 100 meters of that detonation remains, appropriately, unrecorded. The night sky over Eger became white. For several seconds, perhaps longer, the survivors' accounts disagree on duration. The valley below was lit as brightly as noon by a light that was the color of magnesium burning, and that threw every Ottoman tent and formation into sharp, unfamiliar relief. 2,000 camels registered their opinion of the event loudly and simultaneously. The Ottoman soldiers in the nearest forward trenches dove for cover instinctively, uncertain for a vital moment whether they were being attacked or whether the castle was simply destroying itself from the inside. Like a heart torn from a chest. That was what the tower looked like when the light died. A wound in the fabric of the castle, a gap in the outer fortress where solid stone had been, surrounded by rubble and still burning timber, and the faint chemical smell of spent powder hanging in the air like a fog that would not lift. Inside the castle, Dobor did the thing that commanders who survive crises always do. He assessed before he reacted. The tower was gone. The outer wall in that section was compromised. The powder reserve it contained was destroyed. Those were facts. Facts did not ask for his emotional response. They asked for his next decision. His next decision was made before the smoke fully cleared. Fortify the breach from the inside, concentrate the inner fortress defense, prepare for an immediate assault by an enemy that would, correctly, interpret the explosion as the moment of maximum vulnerability. He was right about the interpretation. Ahmed Pasha had seen the white sky, had waited long enough to confirm that the castle had not already collapsed, and had ordered a night assault toward the gap. The Ottomans came through the rubble zone in the dark, moving faster than men moved in daylight because darkness removed the option of caution. They came in numbers that should have been enough, several thousand men pushing through a gap in a wall held by defenders who had just lost their largest powder reserve and were presumably still disoriented from the concussive force of a detonation of that magnitude. But Dobor had prepared for a breach long before the breach existed. The interior approaches to any gap in the outer wall had been blocked, barricaded, and in several cases booby-trapped with the kind of devices that Bornemissza had become expert at constructing. The Ottoman forces that poured through the rubble zone in the dark found themselves in a narrowing funnel of fire and falling stone and the chemical hell of Bornemisza's incendiary devices, detonating in the compressed darkness of a passageway designed to kill everything moving through it. Then Bornemisza rolled the second millstone wheel into the gap. The burning wheel hit the compressed Ottoman formation from above, from the direction they had been told was where the defenders were retreating. It did not arrive as a weapon that made sense within the tactical framework of the assault. It arrived as fire descending from the dark, burning and scattering and impossible to reason about in real time, and the assault formation lost its shape in the same way that a flock of birds loses its shape when a hawk enters it. Suddenly, completely, without any individual decision being the cause. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody lived through the funnel. The night assault failed. The morning light revealed the breach zone empty of Ottoman soldiers. Those who had entered it either dead or withdrawn, leaving behind equipment and weapons that the defenders collected with the grim efficiency of people who had learned not to waste anything. The outer fortress still stood. The powder tower did not. The castle was bleeding, but it was not done. Phase 4. The Women of Eger. By October 11th, the mathematics of the siege had shifted in ways that both sides could feel, but neither could precisely quantify. On the Ottoman side, the shift was in the energy of certainty. The campaign had lasted 32 days against a target that was supposed to have fallen in the first week. Ahmed Pasha's schedule, the immaculate campaign itinerary he had carried north from Constantinople like a map of a future already arranged, was in ruins. The supply situation was not critical, but it was worsening. The camels had moved vast quantities of material north, but vast quantities were what this siege consumed, and the autumn rains that had begun arriving in the nights were turning the valley roads to mud at precisely the pace that supply carts could not easily cope with. The ammunition situation was worse. The marble cannonballs had been expended at a rate that Ahmed had not calculated for a siege of this duration. And on at least 2 occasions, his heaviest guns had fallen silent for days while replacement ammunition was carved and transported from the south. Ali Pasha had been right about something that Ahmed did not want to admit. Their arguments had grown louder in the command tent, overheard, the accounts suggest, by enough people to ensure they would be recorded. Ahmed insisted on continuing the massive frontal assaults. Ali argued for patience, for a more methodical approach that would eventually collapse the castle's walls rather than throwing men against them. Ahmed had more men to throw. Ali had better ideas about not throwing them. On the Hungarian side, the shift was in the particular exhaustion that comes from having survived 3 weeks of something that should have killed you. The kind of exhaustion that is not purely physical, but exists in a layer beneath the physical, in the place where the mind had been holding its breath since September 9th and had not yet been given permission to exhale. Dobo had lost perhaps a third of his combat-capable garrison to death and permanent injury. The faces that had been on the walls in September were different faces now, fewer of them, older-looking than they had been a month ago, carrying the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have been awake for a very long time. The women of the garrison had moved from support roles into positions on the wall walk, and nobody had given an order for this transition because it had not been a transition requiring orders. It had been a natural evolution. When the man beside you falls, you fill his position. And if you are a woman who has been heating cauldrons and carrying ammunition and bandaging wounds for 3 weeks, the wall position he left is not substantially different from what you have already been doing. Ahmed Pasha decided on October 11th that the methodical approach was over. He massed his forces for the kind of assault that has a specific Ottoman tactical term: the general storm, the total engagement of available forces against a designated section of wall, designed to overwhelm the defenders by sheer arithmetic, by presenting more climbers than the wall could pour boiling water on. more attackers than there were people to push back. He targeted the eastern outer wall, still the weakest section, now further damaged by another 10 days of bombardment, and he sent his men forward in a wave that the accounts describe as the largest single assault of the entire siege. The sound reached the inner fortress before the visual did. The collective impact of thousands of boots on the approach slope, the clatter of scaling ladders being brought forward, the Janissary war cry that veterans described as the sound of wind through a very large forest. Then came the archers, providing covering fire from elevated positions outside the walls, and the assault companies behind them, carrying ladders that had been designed specifically for Eger's wall height. The first ladders went up against the eastern wall section. On the wall walk above, the defenders moved with the efficiency of people who have been rehearsing for exactly this moment for weeks, because they had been. Stones went over the parapet first, not aimed, not precise, simply heavy, cascading down onto the ladder tops and the men climbing them with the impersonal effectiveness of gravity. Then the cauldrons tilted, and the water that had been heating since before dawn went over the wall in sheets, and the air above the approach slope smelled briefly of something that is not easily described, but that anyone who has ever burned their hand on a kitchen accident will recognize, scaled to catastrophic proportion. It was the women who carried most of the cauldrons. The woman from the storage room, the one with the economical face and the pot on the fire, was at the wall with a group that the accounts record, with varying degrees of specificity but consistent agreement. They were not fighting in the way that the professional soldiers fought. They were fighting in the way that people fight when they are defending the specific physical space where their lives exist. With totality, with a clarity of purpose that made tactical training largely irrelevant, because purpose and training are two different things. And purpose, at sufficient intensity, does not require the other. The contemporary Ottoman accounts, not the Hungarian accounts, which are understandably generous, but the Ottoman chronicles written by men on the losing side, noted the women on the walls. They noted them the way you note something that does not fit your model of how the world works. Ottoman soldiers had faced determined defenders before. They had not expected women on the wall walk, tilting cauldrons with the same economy of motion that you might use to water a garden, if the garden were an enemy army. The assault compressed against the wall and could not breach it. The scaling ladders went up. The ladders came down, pushed away, overloaded with men who fell backward, struck by stone and fire and the sheer organized refusal of the people above. For every ladder that reached the top, there was a defender ready at the specific point where it arrived. And for every man who reached the top rung, there was a defender ready to ensure the mathematics of that specific encounter resolved in the castle's favor. Dobo moved from section to section, not the kind of commander who fights from a fixed position, but the kind who appears where the line is weakest, whose presence recalculates the courage equation for every man within sight. He took a wound in this assault. Accounts disagree on where and how serious, and stayed on the wall. He had decided, apparently, that being wounded was insufficient grounds for leaving a position that needed to be held. The general storm of October 11th broke against the walls of Eger and fell back. The Huentui took root in those hours. The story of the bull's blood. The legend that Ottoman soldiers, watching the defenders fight with inexplicable endurance, had decided that the red wine being carried along the wall to exhausted fighters was blood, the blood of bulls, drunk by Hungarian warriors to acquire the strength of the animal. The story is almost certainly not true in its literal form. Historians note that red wine was not yet widely produced in the Eger region in 1552, and that the timing of the legend's emergence is suspiciously convenient for subsequent marketing purposes. But myths are rarely about their literal content. The bull's blood story is about how it looked from below, How the defenders of Eger appeared, to the people trying to kill them, as something that normal human beings should not have been able to sustain. They looked like people who had been drinking something that was not fear. Phase 5. The Breaking Point. October 13th, Day 35. The valley had changed. The Ottoman camp that had arrived in September as a city of precise formations and confident geometry had become something more frayed, more improvised. The tents that had been erected in orderly rows now stood in arrangements shaped by necessity rather than protocol, adjusted for mud, for drainage, for proximity to supply lines that had grown longer and less reliable as the autumn wore on. The horses were thinner. The mood in the command tent, according to accounts gathered later from Ottoman sources, had passed through confidence and frustration and anger and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of desperate calculation. Ahmed Pasha had one move left, and he knew it. He called for the final storm. 2 days of continuous attack. Every available asset committed to the breach zones in the eastern outer wall and to as many secondary attack points as could be simultaneously staffed and supported. The principle was saturation. Attack everywhere. Force the garrison to split its attention and its limited manpower across every section of the perimeter simultaneously. And find the point where the human endurance of 2,000 exhausted defenders finally fractured the way walls fracture under repeated impact. Not all at once, but at a specific point, under a specific pressure, at a specific moment when the accumulated damage exceeds the available strength. He sent the assault companies forward on the morning of October 13th with the kind of momentum that should have been irresistible. Inside the castle, the word went out to every person still capable of standing. The battle that followed was the most intense 2 days of the entire siege, which is saying something extraordinary given what the previous 35 days had contained. Ottoman forces attacked the eastern wall, the Bebek Bastion, the Church Bastion, the northern wall near Sandor Bastion, and, for the first time in the siege, the western approach near the Dobo Bastion, spreading the defence thin in exactly the way Ahmed had calculated. The scaling ladders arrived at multiple points simultaneously. The covering fire from Ottoman archers was heavier than it had been in previous assaults, accurate enough to force defenders to keep their heads below the parapet during the critical moments when the ladders were going up. Men climbed the walls of Eger on October 13th and 14th in numbers that exceeded any previous assault. Some reached the top. What they found at the top was not a broken defence, but a defence that had been waiting for exactly this. The final push, the moment of maximum commitment, after which there would be no more reserves and no more escalation. The defenders of Eger had been conserving energy for this, in the way that runners conserve for the final stretch, spending everything else carefully in order to have this left. Dobor was everywhere in those 2 days, on the wall, in the breach zones, at the points where the ladders topped, and the fighting became the kind of close-quarters engagement where the outcome depended not on tactics or artillery or the elegant deployment of forces, but on who was willing to go further. The Ottoman officers, accounts note, were using their swords during those 2 days, not on the enemy, on their own men. This is the moment in a siege when the arithmetic has turned in a direction that cannot be explained to soldiers who can see the numbers. The Ottoman soldiers at Eger had been told this was a routine assignment. They had been told the castle was weak. They had been told about the explosion that had torn out the powder tower, about the casualties the garrison had taken, about the damaged walls and the exhausted defenders. None of that information was false, but it had not included the information that mattered most, because that information was not quantifiable. The information about what the defenders of Eger had decided, collectively and individually, about the specific piece of ground they were standing on, and what it would cost to move them from it. The Ottoman soldiers being pushed forward with swords from behind were not cowards. They were men who had been given an accurate description of the situation and arrived at a reasonable conclusion from it, a conclusion that their officers' swords were countermanding in the most direct possible way. The reasonable conclusion was that this castle was not going to fall today. The officers' conclusion was that it had to, and so the sword. By the afternoon of October 14th, it was clear to everyone present, regardless of which side of the wall they were on, that the final storm was not final enough. The Ottomans had attacked everywhere simultaneously. The defenders had held everywhere simultaneously, holding in the way that things hold at the absolute limit of their strength, visibly strained, visibly fraying, but holding. The eastern outer wall was still in Hungarian hands. The bastions were still in Hungarian hands. The inner fortress had not been reached, and the garrison, smaller, damaged, exhausted beyond what any military manual would have predicted was sustainable, was still on the wall. Ahmed Pasha called off the attack. In his command tent, according to accounts passed down through Ottoman military records, he and Ali Pasha had their final and loudest argument. Ali had been arguing for weeks that the campaign needed to be reconsidered, that the siege was consuming resources and credibility that could not be easily replaced, that continuing to throw men at walls that had already absorbed 37 days of assault was not strategy, but obstinacy. Ahmed's position, reportedly, was that capitulation was unacceptable and that relief forces could be requested. But relief forces were not coming. The campaign season was ending. The rains had arrived in earnest, cold autumn rains that turned the valley below the castle into a landscape of mud and chill that was eating into the Ottoman supply situation from below the way the artillery was eating into the walls from above. The rice rations that the Ottoman infantry depended on had been reduced twice. There were allegations, spreading through the camp, that the supply shortfalls were not purely logistical, but had been worsened by corruption among the quartermaster officers. A rumour that, true or not, had the effect of all such rumours in armies under stress, which is to accelerate the erosion of the confidence that makes soldiers able to do difficult things. On October 17th, Kara Ahmed Pasha ordered the withdrawal of his forces. 3 days of farewell artillery, the Ottoman gesture of contempt for a fortress that had cost them so much and given them nothing, rained cannonballs into the castle with a desultory persistence that had the feel of a man kicking furniture after losing an argument. The explosions shook the walls that had been shaking for 39 days. The defenders crouched in positions they had occupied for 5.5 weeks and let it pass. Ahmed's forces pulled out on October 17th. Ali Pasha's forces, the rearguard, withdrew on October 18th, harassed by Dubour's cavalry on the road south. A final Hungarian exclamation point on a story that nobody in the Ottoman command structure had wanted to be part of. The great jewelled serpent of the hook reversed itself. It turned south in the October rain, moving back through the passes it had entered with such certainty in September. The crescent banners were still flying. The drums were still beating. The rhythm of occupation, not victory now, but the rhythm of an empire that could absorb a setback without acknowledging what a setback meant. Behind it, the castle of Eger stood on its hill, still standing. Dubour stepped outside the walls on the morning of October 18th for the first time in 39 days. He walked down the slope of the hill, the slope that Ottoman assault parties had climbed so many times, from so many directions, with so much force and purpose and human cost. And he stood on the valley floor and looked back up at what he had been inside. What he saw was not the castle he had entered in September. The eastern outer wall had been reshaped by artillery into something that resembled a geological feature more than a military structure. Jagged and irregular, patched with rubble, bearing the marks of every impact in a surface that had been smooth stone 40 days ago. The gate tower was gone. The powder tower was gone. Entire sections of battlements had been knocked flat and replaced with improvised timberworks that looked like what they were: emergency repairs made under fire by people who had no time for elegance. Nearly 12,000 cannonballs had landed in and around the castle during the siege. The number is not poetic exaggeration, but a count made afterward, based on the evidence still embedded in the walls and scattered across the compound. 12,000 individual instances of iron and marble arriving at high velocity from a direction that wanted them dead. The valley around the castle told the rest of the story. The Ottoman siege lines were still visible in the earth. Trenches, earthworks, artillery emplacements, the depressions where the camels had been corralled. All of it already softening in the October rain, returning to something that would eventually become unrecognizable, but still sharp enough on that morning to read like a map of the previous 5 weeks. Equipment had been abandoned in the retreat. Tools, broken weapons, cooking vessels, the detritus of 40,000 people who had arrived expecting to stay for a week and had stayed for 5, and who had left in the kind of haste that leaves things behind. Among the abandoned equipment were cannonballs. Some of them were marble, carved, smooth, surprisingly beautiful in the morning light, polished by the action of their own firing into objects that looked less like instruments of destruction than like ornaments. The defenders collected them. They would be used if the Ottomans came back. The defenders counted their own. Of the approximately 1,530 men and women who had been capable of active defence on September 9th, roughly 500 were dead or permanently maimed. 1 in 3. The number does not fully communicate what it meant in practical terms, because the people represented by it were not anonymous. They were the gunner who had known the German master's name, the farmer from the village whose wife had been at the wall, the specific man whose position Dobor had checked on his night rounds and nodded at. Every blank space in the garrison was a person that had been present and then wasn't. Dobor had lost both of his personal squires, the 2 men whose specific duty had been to stay beside him throughout the battle. The accounts note this detail with a brevity that makes it heavier. Not that he grieved, not what he said, simply that they were gone, which was enough. Gergely Bornemisza stood at the foot of the hill beside the remains of his last millstone wheel, burned down to its iron fittings and a few scorched wooden pieces, with his hands at his sides. The burns on his hands, acquired in the testing phase weeks before the first assault, had healed to scars by October. He was 20-something, still young enough that the siege had aged him visibly, and he was looking at the valley in the specific way that people look at things they cannot entirely believe they survived. His 250 men had become fewer. His weapons had changed the course of multiple assaults. His name would outlast the century. The Ottoman casualties are harder to calculate. Contemporary estimates from both sides vary wildly. Hungarian sources, understandably, tended toward numbers that maximize the accomplishment. Ottoman sources, understandably, did not produce comprehensive after-action reports that would have required acknowledging the scale of the failure. Modern historical analysis suggests somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 Ottoman killed and wounded, a number that, if accurate, represents a casualty rate that explained, in purely logistical terms, why Ahmed Pasha had chosen to withdraw rather than continue. You cannot sustain losses at that rate against a fortress that has not fallen and expect the campaign to recover. Kara Ahmed Pasha returned to Constantinople, carrying the weight of the campaign's conclusion. The summer of 1552 had been, in the broad sense, a success for the Ottoman Empire. Temeshvar, Szolnok, Veszprém, Lipa, and 25 smaller strongholds had all fallen, extending Ottoman control significantly through central Hungary. But the campaign had ended at Eger, and Eger had not fallen. And in the accounting of empires, an ending without the final conquest has a way of defining the whole, regardless of what came before. Ahmed Pasha was executed several years later, for reasons unrelated to Eger, caught in the political currents of Ottoman court politics that had claimed more capable men than him. Whether the failure at Eger contributed to his trajectory within the imperial hierarchy is a matter that the sources approach carefully but do not resolve. He died as viziers sometimes died in the 16th century, suddenly, without ceremony, for reasons the Sultan declined to specify in detail. Dobo's fate was more complex, and, in its way, more damning of the world he had saved. After the siege, he and every surviving officer who had defended Eger submitted their resignations to King Ferdinand I of Habsburg. The reason was not exhaustion and not the desire for retirement. It was protest. The cold, public, documented protest of men who had held an indefensible position without support, without reinforcement, without any meaningful assistance from the king in whose service they served, and who wanted the record to reflect that the victory of Eger had been achieved not because of the Habsburg administration, but despite it. Vienna had not sent help. Vienna had not sent money. Vienna had sent polite letters. Dobo wrote his protest in the only language that cannot be ignored by an emperor. He handed back the command of the fortress that he had just finished saving. Gergely Bornemissa was appointed to replace him. The young innovator, the builder of millstone weapons and incendiary grenades, took command of the fortress he had helped defend with fire and ingenuity. Several years later, on a road outside Eger, he was ambushed by Ottoman forces, captured, hanged. The man who had made fire serve the defense of Hungary was killed by the empire he had embarrassed. The castle stood. Its defenders did not all survive the peace. The immediate strategic consequences of Eger's survival played out across the following months in the quiet arithmetic of things that did not happen. The Ottoman army did not continue north to Kassa. The silver mines of Upper Hungary continued to produce the coinage that funded Habsburg resistance, not just in Hungary, but across the complex and always strained machinery of Ferdinand's empire. The logistical corridor that would have allowed more frequent and better supplied Ottoman sieges of Vienna remained closed. The Vegvar system, the network of border fortresses that was Hungary's primary military architecture after the catastrophe of Mohacs, was reinforced in the years following Eger, partly because the empire finally understood, after watching the castle hold, what properly prepared and properly motivated defenders could accomplish even against overwhelming force. Vienna survived the second half of the 16th century in a condition that owed something, in a traceable historical thread, to 39 days in October on a hill in northern Hungary. The Ottomans remained the dominant military power in the region. Nothing about Eger changed that. They still held Buda. They still controlled the central Hungarian plain. They still had the capability and the intention to continue expanding northward whenever the moment was opportune. Eger was a setback, not a reversal, and the Ottoman Empire was large enough that setbacks were absorbed into its operation the way rivers absorb tributaries, without materially altering the current. But then came 1596. 44 years after István Dobo had stood at his wall and refused to read the arithmetic below him, the Ottoman army returned to Eger. This time, they brought the Sultan himself. Mehmed III in personal command, demonstrating the seriousness of Ottoman intent and perhaps also the institutional memory of 1552. This time, the defence of the castle had been entrusted to 7,000 men, more than 3 times the garrison that Dobor had commanded. Professional soldiers, mostly foreign mercenaries from across Central Europe, better armed, better supplied, defending a fortress that had been further reinforced in the 4 decades since the Great Siege. They held for 3 weeks. Then they opened the gate. The contrast is not subtle. 1552, 2,000 people, roughly a third of them not professional soldiers, no prospect of relief, no external support, defending a fortress already weakened by years of deferred maintenance, and they held for 39 days and never surrendered. 1596, 7,000 professional soldiers in a reinforced fortress with a sultan camped outside, and they negotiated terms after 21 days. The question that Hungarian historians have been asking ever since is the right question, because it does not have a comfortable answer. What changed? Not the walls, not the weapons, not the numbers. The 1596 garrison was larger, better equipped, better trained in the technical sense that a standing army is always technically better than a garrison of farmers and women and one young man with a millstone wheel. What changed was the thing that cannot be inventoried, cannot be requisitioned, cannot be delivered by supply camel from Constantinople or anywhere else. The men who held Eger in 1552 were defending something specific. The location was their home. The outcome was their future. The walls they stood on were the walls of the place where their children lived. You cannot hire that commitment. You cannot import it. You cannot manufacture it on a timeline set by imperial logistics. It either exists in the specific relationship between specific people and a specific piece of ground, or it does not. And no amount of military training or professional competence is a reliable substitute when the moment arrives and the arithmetic says you should stop. Eger fell in 1596 and remained in Ottoman hands for 91 years. The Ottomans built a minaret, a slender tower of Muslim prayer in the captured city, the northernmost minaret of the entire Ottoman Empire, a physical marker of how far the crescent had reached into the heart of Europe. That minaret stands today, the last Ottoman minaret in Hungary, preserved as a historical monument in a city that has been Hungarian again for 3 centuries. It is not a monument to Ottoman conquest, it is a monument to time, to the fact that empires come and go, that even the most overwhelming forces eventually reverse, that the world changes at a pace that makes all military certainties provisional. The castle of Eger, the one Dorbo held, the one Bornemissa turned into a laboratory of improvised destruction, the one whose walls absorbed 12,000 cannonballs and returned them, was eventually restored. It sits today on its hill east of the modern city, considerably tidied up from its 1552 state, accessible to tourists who come to see the bastions and the underground tunnels, and the museum that tells the story of the siege in the careful, organized way that museums tell stories. You can walk the wall walk. You can stand at Bebek Bastion and look down the slope that the Ottoman assault companies climbed. You can see the valley spread out below, green and peaceful in summer, the Eger River catching the light in the way rivers always catch light, regardless of what happened near them. Every day at 15 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, 1552 in the 24-hour notation, the year encoded in the time, a cannon fires from the castle. One shot, not aimed at anything, just the sound, travelling across the valley and back from the hills, reminding the present moment that something happened here. In 1899, a writer named Géza Gardoni published a novel about the siege, Egri Csillagok, which translates roughly as Eclipse of the Crescent Moon, or Stars of Eger, that became one of the most beloved books in Hungarian literary history, read by every Hungarian schoolchild for generations, adapted into films, taught in classrooms, referenced in political speeches, invoked whenever the Hungarian national identity needed a story about what Hungarians were capable of when the chips were down. Gardoni's Dobo and Bornemisa and the Women of the Wall became the versions that live in Hungarian cultural memory, burnished and dramatized and probably improved upon, but rooted in something that actually happened on a hill in 1552, and that the raw historical record confirms in its essential outline. What history records is this: 35 to 40,000 of the finest soldiers on earth, backed by the most sophisticated siege artillery of the age, commanded by senior officers of an empire that had never lost a major campaign in living memory, besieged a castle held by 2,000 people, some of them farmers, some of them women, one of them a young man with a talent for incendiary millstones, for 39 days. And then they left. They did not take the castle. The deeper truth, the one that threads through the military analysis and the cultural legacy and the cannon that fires at 1552 every afternoon, is that Eger was never primarily about weapons or walls or tactical innovation, though all of those things mattered. It was about the moment when a group of people decided, clearly and without self-deception, what they were not willing to give up. That moment happens in history occasionally. It does not always result in victory. Courage is not a guarantee. It is, at most, the thing that makes victory possible when victory would otherwise have been impossible. At Eger, it was enough. Centuries later, the valley is quiet. The camels are gone. The Zarbuzan are in museums. The approach slopes are covered with grass, and the hillside that Ottoman assault companies climbed through fire and falling stone is a gentle walk that takes less than 5 minutes at tourist pace. The walls that absorbed 12,000 cannonballs have been repaired and repaired again until they are almost new, bearing only traces of what happened to them in the autumn of 1552. But stand on the wall at Bebek Bastion on an October morning when the fog comes in from the Matra Hills the way it came in on September 9th, 1552, and look down at the valley below. You can see, if you look long enough, what 2,000 people decided to defend. And they did.